Gray clouds hung low in the sky as black cars lined up outside St. Mary's Church. The Blackwood family arrived in sleek vehicles, one after another, their faces solemn behind dark sunglasses. They were the kind of people who turned heads, not just because of their designer clothes or the way they carried themselves, but because everyone in town knew they owned half of it. Today they gathered to say goodbye to Richard Blackwood, who had built an empire from nothing but hard work and clever decisions. At 78, he had finally lost his battle with heart disease, leaving behind a fortune that had been the subject of whispers and speculation for years. Thomas Blackwood, the oldest son, stepped out of his car first. His wife Penny followed, adjusting her hat and straightening her back. Together they looked like they belonged on the cover of a business magazine, perfect, polished, and completely in control. Behind them came Richard's other children, Violet with her husband Gregory and Daniel, who had flown in from overseas where he managed the family's international investments. Quite the turnout, Thomas said quietly, surveying the crowd of business associates and social connections filling the churchyard. Father would have been pleased. Penny nodded, though her eyes were already scanning the gathering. The governor sent his condolences. He couldn't attend but sent his assistant with a wreath. Good. Very good. Thomas straightened his tie. Let's get through this with the dignity Father would expect. The Blackwoods moved as a unit toward the church entrance, accepting handshakes and brief embraces from people who mattered in their world. Eleanor Blackwood, Richard's wife of 52 years, was the last to arrive. Her driver helped her from the car and she stood for a moment. A slender figure in expensive black silk, her white hair perfectly styled despite the light drizzle that had begun to fall. Mother, Thomas offered his arm, which she took with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, dear. Let's not keep everyone waiting. If anyone had been watching closely, really watching, not just observing, they might have noticed a small figure standing near the church steps, partially hidden behind a large floral arrangement. A boy of about 10 or 11 dressed in clothes that were clean but obviously not new. His shoes were scuffed at the toes and his jacket sleeves stopped a bit short of his wrists. But what stood out most was his face, red-eyed and tear-streaked in a way none of the Blackwoods' faces were. The boy, Jamie, shifted from one foot to another, unsure where he should stand or if he should be there at all. The lady from the children's home had brought him, saying it was important to say goodbye properly. She stood a few steps away, checking her watch and looking uncomfortable among the wealthy mourners. Are you sure we should be here? Jamie asked her, his voice small against the murmur of the crowd. Mr. Blackwood visited you every month for 3 years, she replied. He would want you here. Inside the church, the Blackwood family took their places in the front row. The organist played softly as people filed in, filling the pews with expensive perfume and quiet conversation. Thomas leaned over to whisper something to his brother Daniel, who nodded and glanced back at the doors. Who's handling the guest book? Daniel asked. Henderson has it covered, Thomas replied. No one gets in without being on the list. But Henderson, the family's longtime assistant, had stepped away for a moment when Jamie and his social worker entered. They slipped in and found seats near the back, the boy clutching a small, worn book to his chest, a copy of The Little Prince with a handwritten note tucked inside. The service began with a piece of classical music Richard had selected himself. The minister spoke of a life well lived, of business success and community contributions. The Blackwoods sat perfectly still, back straight, head slightly bowed at appropriate moments. If there were tears, they were discreet, dabbed away with monogrammed handkerchiefs. When family members were invited to share memories, Thomas spoke of his father's business wisdom. Violet mentioned charity events they had organized together. Daniel recalled fishing trips that always turned into lessons about patience and strategy. Eleanor talked about their travels around the world. None of them mentioned bedtime stories or teaching a child to fly a kite or bringing soup when someone was sick. None of them spoke of the Richard who had visited an orphanage regularly, who had sat with a lonely boy and made him feel special. From his seat in the back, Jamie listened and cried silently, not for the businessmen they described, but for the kind man who had taught him to play chess and laughed at his jokes. Each tear that fell was genuine in a room where grief seemed more like a formality. Halfway through the service, Jamie let out a small sob that echoed in a moment of silence. Heads turned, including Thomas Blackwood's. His eyes narrowed as they landed on the boy. When the minister invited everyone to bow their heads for prayer, Thomas slipped out of his seat and walked briskly to the back of the church. He approached Henderson, who had returned to his post. "Who let them in?" Thomas nodded toward Jamie and the social worker. Henderson looked confused. "I'm not sure, sir. They weren't on the—" "Handle it," Thomas said quietly but firmly. "This is a private family service." Henderson hesitated. "Sir, the boy seems upset." "Perhaps that's exactly the problem. We don't need a scene. My mother is distressed enough." As the prayer ended and people lifted their heads, Henderson reluctantly approached the social worker and bent to whisper in her ear. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she nodded and touched Jamie's shoulder. "We need to go," she whispered. Jamie looked up, confusion and hurt crossing his face. "But we didn't say goodbye yet." "I'm sorry, Jamie, there's been a mistake. This section is for family only." The boy looked toward the front where the Blackwoods sat, wondering if any of them were thinking about the stories Richard had told him. Stories about fishing trips with his sons and traveling with his wife. Richard had made his family sound warm and wonderful, but none of them had ever come with him to the children's home. None of them even knew Jamie existed. As they stood to leave, Jamie dropped his book. The sound wasn't loud, but in the quiet church it caught Eleanor Blackwood's attention. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting Jamie's for a brief moment across the space between them. Something flickered across her perfect composure, curiosity perhaps, or the faintest recognition. But then Thomas returned to his seat beside her, whispering something that made her turn away. Outside, the rain had picked up. Jamie and his social worker hurried toward the bus stop, having no car to shelter in. "I don't understand," Jamie said, his voice catching. "Why didn't they want us there?" Mr. Blackwood said family was the most important thing in the world. The social worker sighed, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes families are complicated, Jamie." Back in the church, the service continued. Elegant flower arrangements were admired. Appropriate music played. The Blackwoods maintained their dignity as they escorted Richard's casket to the hearse. At the cemetery, under a large canopy that kept the rain off expensive shoes, Thomas delivered final remarks about legacy and responsibility. The family stood together for photographs that would later appear in the business section of the newspaper, captioned with words like stoic and united in grief. None of them noticed the small figure watching from a distance, standing in the rain because he hadn't been invited under the canopy. Jamie had convinced his social worker to bring him to the cemetery after promising to stay out of the way. He needed to say goodbye, even if it had to be from far away. As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Catherine Blackwood, Richard's sister and the oldest member of the family present, paused while walking to her car. Something had caught her eye, a splash of color against the gray day. Squinting through the drizzle, she noticed the small boy standing alone by a tree. For a moment, she seemed about to walk toward him. Her step hesitated and her head tilted slightly in a way that reminded Jamie so much of Richard that fresh tears sprang to his eyes. But then Thomas called for her, holding an umbrella and gesturing impatiently, and the moment passed. Catherine turned away, leaving Jamie to whisper his goodbye to the only person who had made him feel like he mattered. Later, as the Blackwoods gathered at the family estate for the reception, talk quickly turned to practical matters. "When is the reading of the will scheduled?" Violet asked, sipping a glass of expensive scotch, Richard's favorite. "Tomorrow at 10, Thomas replied. "Maxwell's office. Everyone needs to be there." Daniel nodded. "Any surprises expected?" Thomas shook his head confidently. Father was always clear about his intentions. The business stays in the family, divided as we discussed years ago. Mother is well provided for, of course. Eleanor Blackwood sat by the window watching the rain. For a moment, her thoughts drifted to the boy she had glimpsed in church, those tear-filled eyes that had seemed to be grieving not for show, but from the heart. "Did anyone else notice that child at the service?" she asked suddenly. The room fell quiet. Thomas cleared his throat. "Just some boy who wandered in with a social worker. Henderson handled it." Eleanor frowned slightly. "He seemed affected by Richard's passing." "Mother, half the town claims some connection to father," Violet said dismissively. "People always appear when there's money involved." Eleanor nodded slowly, accepting this explanation because it was easier than asking more questions. The family returned to their discussions about the estate, about who would speak to the press, about when business operations would fully resume. None of them suspected that in less than 24 hours, their carefully ordered world would be turned upside down by the contents of Richard Blackwood's will and by the boy with the tear-stained face who had loved their father in a way none of them had bothered to do for years after the funeral. The Blackwood estate buzzed with quiet activity. Staff moved efficiently through the large rooms, serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres to guests who had come to pay their respects. Crystal glasses clinked, and hushed conversations created a gentle hum beneath the classical music playing softly in the background. Thomas Blackwood stood near the grand fireplace, accepting condolences with a firm handshake and appropriate nods. His wife Penny remained close, touching his arm occasionally in a show of support that looked rehearsed. They were a power couple, and even in grief they maintained the image. "Your father was a titan," said George Wilson, the mayor. "The city won't be the same without him." "Thank you, George. Father always appreciated your support," Thomas replied, his voice measured. "We intend to continue his legacy, of course." In the dining room, Eleanor sat with her closest friends, wealthy women who had summered together for decades. They spoke in low voices about practical matters: who would take over Richard's position on various boards, what would happen to their annual charity gala, whether Eleanor would keep the summer house in the Hamptons. "You'll need to get away, dear," said Patricia Kent, patting Eleanor's hand. "After everything settles." Eleanor nodded, her eyes drifting toward the large portrait of Richard that hung over the sideboard. It showed him as he had been 10 years ago, commanding, serious, every inch the successful businessman. Had his eyes always been that cold? She couldn't remember now. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the day remained gray. Jamie stood on the sidewalk across from the Blackwood estate, staring at the large iron gates and the house beyond. His social worker, Mrs. Chen, had tried to convince him to return to the children's home, but he had begged to come here instead. "I just want to see where he lived," Jamie had said. "Please, Mrs. Chen. I never got to say goodbye properly." Now they stood together, Jamie's small hand clutching the copy of The Little Prince that Richard had given him for his 9th birthday. Inside was the note that read, "To Jamie, remember that what is essential is invisible to the eye. Your friend Richard." "We shouldn't be here," Mrs. Chen said gently. "This is a private time for his family." "But he told me stories about this house," Jamie replied, his voice small but determined. "He said there was a tree house he built for his kids in the backyard, and a library with books from floor to ceiling. He said someday he might show me." Mrs. Chen sighed, knowing how much these visits from Richard had meant to Jamie. The old man had appeared at Sunshine Children's Home 3 years ago, asking to volunteer as a reader. No one had expected him to form such a bond with the quiet boy who rarely spoke to anyone else. 10 more minutes, she conceded. "Then we really need to go." Inside the Blackwood estate, Violet approached her brother Thomas, a slight frown creasing her perfectly made-up face. "There's a child standing outside the gates with some woman," she said quietly. "I think it's the same boy from the church." Thomas turned sharply, his jaw tightening. "What is he doing here? This is becoming inappropriate." Daniel joined them, swirling the scotch in his glass. "What's happening?" "That boy from the funeral is loitering outside," Thomas explained. "I'm going to have security speak with him." "Is that really necessary?" asked Catherine, Richard's sister, who had overheard the conversation. "He's just a child, Thomas." "A child who's becoming a nuisance," Thomas replied firmly. "Father's funeral is not a public event." Catherine looked like she might say more, but instead pressed her lips together and walked away. At 73, she was the family matriarch now that Richard was gone. But her opinion rarely swayed Thomas once his mind was made up. Outside, Jamie had stepped closer to the gates, peering through the iron bars. The book was still clutched tightly in his hands, as if it connected him to the man who had given it to him. A security guard approached from inside the property, his face professionally blank. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested the opposite. Mrs. Chen stepped forward quickly. "I'm sorry, we were just leaving." "No, wait," Jamie said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "I need to talk to them. I need to tell them about Mr. Blackwood." The guard looked uncomfortable. "This is a private residence? The family is not receiving unscheduled visitors." "But they don't know," Jamie insisted, his eyes filling with tears again. "They don't know how he would read to me every Wednesday. They don't know he taught me chess or that he brought me soup when I had the flu. The guard's expression softened slightly, but he remained firm. "I'm sorry, son. Those are my instructions." Before Mrs. Chen could lead Jamie away, the gate intercom crackled. "What's going on there, Phillips?" It was Thomas Blackwood's voice. "A young boy and his guardian, sir. I've asked them to leave." There was a pause, then. "I'll handle this." A few minutes later, Thomas Blackwood himself walked down the long driveway toward the gates. His posture was rigid, his face set in lines of barely contained irritation. "I believe my family has been more than patient," he said without preamble. "First the church, now here. This is becoming harassment." Mrs. Chen flushed with embarrassment. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood. We meant no disrespect." "Jamie was close to your father." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. "My father? I highly doubt that. My father was a very private man with a small circle of trusted friends and family." Jamie looked up at Thomas, seeing nothing of Richard in this cold, impatient man. "He came to see me every week for 3 years, he said quietly. "He never missed, not even when it snowed really bad last winter." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. "That's impossible. My father was in board meetings every Wednesday afternoon." "Not from 4 to 6, Jamie replied. "That's when he came to read to us. But mostly just to me because—" He hesitated, then continued. "Because he said I reminded him of someone." Thomas stared at Jamie for a long moment, his mind working through this unexpected information. Finally he said, "What's your name?" "Jamie. Jamie Wells." "And how exactly did you come to know my father?" Mrs. Chen answered. "Richard began volunteering at Sunshine Children's Home 3 years ago. He took a special interest in Jamie." Thomas's face registered surprise and then skepticism. "My father? Volunteering at an orphanage? That doesn't sound like him at all. He read to me," Jamie said, holding up his book, "and he taught me chess. He said his daughter used to love chess too." At the mention of a daughter, Thomas's face hardened. "My father had 2 sons and 1 daughter. My sister Violet is inside, very much alive. I don't know what game you're playing, Thomas. What's happening?" Everyone turned to see Catherine walking slowly down the driveway, her cane tapping against the pavement. Despite her age, she carried herself with dignity, her silver hair swept into an elegant knot. "Aunt Catherine, please go back inside." "I'm handling this," Thomas said, his voice tight. Catherine ignored him, her eyes fixed on Jamie. "You're the boy from the church," she said. "The one who was crying?" Jamie nodded, suddenly shy under her direct gaze. "Why were you crying, child?" she asked gently. "Did you know my brother?" "Yes, ma'am," Jamie replied. "He was my friend." Catherine's expression softened further. "Your friend? How lovely. Richard always could surprise me, even after all these years." Thomas made an impatient sound. "Aunt Catherine, this is ridiculous. Father never mentioned this child or any volunteer work. It's obviously some kind of scheme." "Oh, be quiet, Thomas," Catherine said sharply. "Not everything is a business transaction or a threat to the family name." She turned back to Jamie. "Would you like to come inside, dear? I think we should talk." Mrs. Chen looked uncertain. "I don't know if that's appropriate." "I insist," Catherine said with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Phillips, open the gate." The security guard hesitated, looking to Thomas for confirmation. Thomas stood rigid for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Fine, but this will be brief." Inside the house, conversations paused as Catherine led Jamie and Mrs. Chen into the grand foyer. Guests stared openly, and Violet nudged her husband, whispering behind her hand. Eleanor looked up from her seat, her eyes widening at the sight of the boy from the church. "Catherine, what is this?" she asked, rising slowly. "This young man was a friend of Richard's," Catherine replied. "His name is Jamie Wells." Eleanor's perfectly composed face showed the first genuine emotion of the day. Confusion. "A friend? But he's just a child." Jamie stood awkwardly in his worn clothes, acutely aware of the luxury surrounding him and the many eyes watching. The book in his hand seemed to give him courage. "Mr. Blackwood came to read to me," he explained quietly. "Every Wednesday for 3 years." "He never told you?" The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief and, from Thomas, growing anger. "This is absurd," he finally said. "Father was a busy man. He didn't have time for—" "For what, Thomas?" Catherine interrupted. "For kindness? For friendship? Is that really so hard to believe?" Daniel, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward. Why would Father keep something like this secret from all of us? It was a question no one could answer, least of all Jamie, who was beginning to wish he had never come. The weight of the family's stares made him want to disappear. Perhaps, Eleanor said slowly, there are things about Richard none of us knew. Her eyes lingered on Jamie's face, searching for something only she could see. Violet approached, her high heels clicking on the marble floor. Mother, this is hardly the time for whatever this is. We have guests. Yes, we do, Eleanor agreed, straightening her shoulders. And one of them appears to have been special to your father. She extended her hand to Jamie. Would you like some cake, Jamie? Richard always had a sweet tooth, though he pretended otherwise. It was the first genuine moment of warmth Jamie had felt from any of the Blackwoods. He nodded, a small smile breaking through his sadness. As Eleanor led Jamie toward the dining room, Thomas caught Mrs. Chen's arm. This changes nothing, he said quietly. The will is being read tomorrow. After that, everything goes back to normal. Mrs. Chen met his gaze steadily. I'm not sure what you think is happening here, Mr. Blackwood, but Jamie truly cared for your father. That's all? We'll see, Thomas replied, his voice cool. We'll see tomorrow what Father really thought about this friendship. What none of them knew yet was that Richard Blackwood had indeed been thinking of Jamie when he finalized his will 6 months ago. And tomorrow, in the offices of Maxwell Porter, longtime attorney to the Blackwood family, all the secrets Richard had kept would finally come to light. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Maxwell Porter's law office, casting long rectangles of sunshine across the polished hardwood floor. The conference room was impressive, designed to intimidate with its massive mahogany table, leather chairs, and walls lined with law books that nobody ever seemed to read. Thomas Blackwood arrived first, precisely 15 minutes early, as was his habit. He adjusted his gold cufflinks and checked his watch, a luxury timepiece that had been a gift from his father on his 40th birthday. The memory brought no warmth to his face. Coffee, Mr. Blackwood? Asked the receptionist, a young woman who seemed to shrink under his gaze. Black, no sugar, he replied without looking at her. And water for the others. Within the next 10 minutes, the remaining Blackwoods arrived. Violet and her husband Gregory took seats near Thomas. Daniel chose the opposite side, loosening his tie slightly as he sat down. Eleanor entered with Catherine, the two women speaking quietly as they settled into their chairs. Has everyone signed the attendance sheet? Maxwell Porter asked as he entered the room. He was in his 60s with silver hair and the patient expression of someone who had dealt with wealthy families and their drama for decades. Thomas nodded curtly. We're all here. Let's begin. Maxwell adjusted his glasses. Not quite everyone, I'm afraid. We're still waiting on... The door opened and Mrs. Chen appeared with Jamie by her side. The boy looked even smaller today, dressed in his best clothes, a button-up shirt that was slightly too big and pants that had been carefully ironed. His hair was combed neatly and he clutched a folder of papers that Mrs. Chen had helped him prepare. Thomas stood up abruptly. What is the meaning of this? Why is he here? Maxwell remained calm. Per your father's explicit instructions, Jamie Wells is to be present for the reading of the will. The room fell silent. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. Violet exchanged a look with her husband while Daniel leaned forward, suddenly more interested. Ridiculous, Thomas muttered, but he sat back down. Maxwell gestured to 2 empty chairs. Please have a seat. Jamie moved hesitantly to the chair, looking around the room at the faces that were now familiar from the funeral and yesterday's uncomfortable visit. Only Catherine offered a small smile of encouragement. Before we begin, Maxwell said, opening a leather portfolio, I want to make it clear that everything I'm about to read reflects the final wishes of Richard Blackwood, signed and witnessed 6 months ago. These documents are legally binding and have been prepared with the utmost care. He placed a pair of reading glasses on his nose and cleared his throat. I'll begin with the formal introduction. The family sat in tense silence as Maxwell read through the legal preamble. Jamie fidgeted slightly in his chair, not understanding most of the words but feeling the weight of them nonetheless. Now, to the substance of the will, Maxwell continued, turning a page. I, Richard Arthur Blackwood, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament, hereby revoking all wills and codicils previously made by me, He looked up briefly, then continued. Before I outline the distribution of my assets, I wish to address my family directly. The tone of the document changed, becoming more personal, as if Richard himself were speaking to them from beyond the grave. To my family, for many years, I have watched as the wealth I created has shaped you in ways I never intended. I built a business empire to provide for you, to give you opportunities I never had. But somewhere along the way, money became more important than the values I hoped to instill. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Violet's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palm. Thomas, you learned to be ruthless in business, but never understood that success without compassion is meaningless. Violet, you embraced the social status our name provided, but forgot to develop your own identity beyond it. Daniel, you traveled the world on the family fortune, but remained a stranger to your own heart. Each Blackwood reacted differently to these pointed observations. Thomas's face flushed with anger. Violet looked away and Daniel stared at the table, his expression unreadable. Eleanor, my wife and companion for over 50 years, you stood by me through everything, and for that I am grateful. But we both know that over time, we became partners in name only, living separate lives under the same roof. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, her composed face revealing nothing of what she felt inside. I tell you these hard truths not to hurt you, but because I failed you as a father and husband. I gave you wealth but not wisdom, security but not love. For that I am truly sorry. The room was completely silent now. Even Thomas seemed stunned by the frank assessment. Maxwell turned another page. And now I must tell you about someone you don't know, someone who deserves to be part of this family more than anyone I've ever met. Jamie looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. 3 years ago, I received a letter from a social worker at Sunshine Children's Home. This letter informed me that I had a grandson. Gasps echoed around the table. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. As you all know, our youngest daughter, Rose, left home 15 years ago after a terrible argument. What you don't know is that she was pregnant when she left. Thomas stood up again. This is absurd. Rose never said anything about being pregnant. Because none of you would listen, Catherine said quietly from her seat. You were too busy judging her. Maxwell continued reading. Rose died in childbirth. Her son, my grandson, was placed in the care of the state. Through circumstances I can only call divine intervention, I discovered his existence when a fundraising letter from his orphanage crossed my desk. The boy's name and birth date caught my attention, and I began to investigate. Jamie sat perfectly still, his young mind struggling to process what he was hearing. DNA testing confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Jamie Wells is my grandson, Rose's child, and a Blackwood by blood. The room erupted in exclamations and questions. Thomas demanded proof. Violet looked as if she might faint. Daniel stared at Jamie with new interest. Silence, please, Maxwell said firmly. The documentation is all here, including the DNA results. He tapped a thick folder beside him. Richard had everything verified through multiple sources. Eleanor turned to look at Jamie, really look at him for the first time. Rose's child, she whispered. There were tears in her eyes. Maxwell waited for the commotion to settle before continuing. For the past 3 years, I have had the privilege of getting to know my grandson without revealing my identity to him. I wanted to understand who he was without the Blackwood name influencing him. What I discovered was a kind, intelligent boy with Rose's gentle spirit, and none of the entitlement that wealth can breed. Jamie looked down at his hands, overwhelmed by the words and the attention now focused on him. And now to the distribution of my estate, Maxwell read. To my grandson, Jamie Wells, I leave the majority of my personal fortune, to be held in trust until he reaches the age of 25. This includes my controlling shares in Blackwood Industries, my personal investment portfolio, and my residential properties in New York, London, and the Hamptons. Thomas jumped to his feet. This is outrageous. A child we've never met suddenly inheriting everything. I'll contest this immediately. Maxwell remained calm. I suggest you listen to the rest before making decisions. Mr. Blackwood. Thomas sat down reluctantly, his face flushed with anger. However, Maxwell continued, there is a condition to this inheritance. Jamie will only receive his full inheritance if the Blackwood family welcomes him as one of their own. Confused glances were exchanged around the table. Specifically, Jamie must be legally adopted by a member of the Blackwood family and raised in a loving home until he reaches adulthood. He must be treated as a true family member. provided with the same opportunities and care that would be given to any Blackwood child. Mrs. Chen placed a protective hand on Jamie's shoulder as Maxwell continued. If this condition is not met, the entire estate, with the exception of minor bequests I will outline shortly, will go to a list of charitable organizations dedicated to supporting orphaned children. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas's calculating mind was already working through the implications, his initial outrage giving way to strategic thinking. To be clear, Maxwell added, I have appointed a guardian ad litem and established a monitoring system to ensure this condition is met in spirit, not just in letter. Any adoption that proves to be motivated solely by financial gain will be invalidated. Eleanor spoke for the first time since the revelation. May I see him? The boy, Jamie? Her voice broke slightly on his name. Jamie looked up as Eleanor approached him, her elegant hands trembling. She knelt down, something she had probably not done in decades, to look him in the eyes. You have her smile, Eleanor said softly, Rose's smile. Jamie didn't know how to respond. He had never known his mother, had no pictures of her, no stories. And now suddenly he had a grandmother looking at him as if he were a miracle. Thomas cleared his throat. Let's be practical about this. Assuming the DNA tests are legitimate, we need to discuss next steps. His tone had shifted to business-like efficiency, already adapting to this new reality. The DNA tests are legitimate, Maxwell confirmed. And there's more. Richard left individual letters for each of you to be read privately. He handed out sealed envelopes to each family member. He asked that you read these in private after you've had time to process today's news. Catherine, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. I think we should consider what's best for Jamie in all this. He's just lost the only person who connected him to this family, and now his whole life is about to change. Mrs. Chen nodded gratefully. At least one person was thinking about Jamie's well-being rather than the money. There will be time to discuss all the details, Maxwell said, gathering his papers. For now, I suggest everyone take some time to absorb what you've learned today. We can reconvene next week to discuss the practical arrangements. As the meeting concluded, the Blackwoods filed out of the room in a daze, each lost in their own thoughts. Thomas was already on his phone, presumably calling his personal lawyer. Violet and Gregory whispered intensely to each other. Daniel lingered, looking at Jamie with an expression that might have been curiosity or calculation. Only Eleanor remained behind, still kneeling in front of her newly discovered grandson. Would you like to see a picture of your mother? She asked softly. Jamie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Eleanor opened her purse and took out a small photo album she had brought to show Maxwell some document. She turned to a page in the middle and pointed to a young woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile. That's Rose, she said. That's your mother. For the first time since Richard's death, Jamie felt a tiny spark of hope amidst his grief. He wasn't alone in the world after all. He had a family, even if they had only just discovered him. The Blackwood estate felt different now. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as the family tried to make sense of the bombshell that had been dropped in Maxwell Porter's office. It had been 3 days since the reading of the will, and the shockwaves were still rippling through their carefully ordered lives. In the main study, Thomas paced back and forth while his personal lawyer, Howard Greenfield, reviewed documents spread across the desk. There must be a way to contest this, Thomas insisted, his voice tight with frustration. DNA test or not, we can't just hand over the family legacy to some child none of us knew existed until a week ago. Howard sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. I've been over everything multiple times, Thomas. Your father was very thorough. The DNA evidence is conclusive, the will is airtight, and the trust structure is virtually bulletproof. What about Rose's pregnancy? There's no proof she told anyone in the family. We could argue that by keeping it secret, she forfeited any claim her child might have. Howard shook his head. That wouldn't hold up. Besides, according to your Aunt Catherine's statement, Rose did try to tell the family. She was simply not believed or listened to. Thomas stopped pacing, his hands clenching into fists. Catherine always took Rose's side. She's hardly a reliable witness. The court won't see it that way. She's a respected member of the community with no financial stake in this matter. Her testimony would be considered credible. Thomas turned to stare out the window. In the garden below, Eleanor was walking slowly along the path, her face tilted up to catch the morning sun. She looked different somehow, lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. "What about the adoption requirement?" Thomas asked finally. "If no one in the family is willing to adopt the boy, what happens then?" "Then, as the will states, the bulk of the estate goes to charity. You and your siblings would receive only the minimal bequests outlined in the secondary provisions, about 5% each of the total estate," Thomas calculated quickly. 5% of his father's fortune was still substantial, but nowhere near what he had been expecting. Nowhere near what he felt he deserved after years of running the business while his father took all the credit. And if someone does adopt him, the person who becomes his legal guardian, do they control his inheritance until he's 25? Howard adjusted his glasses. "No, that's another clever aspect of your father's plan. The trust is managed by an independent board of trustees. The guardian would receive a generous stipend for Jamie's care and education, but would have no direct control over the bulk of the fortune or the company shares." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind working through the implications. "I see." In another part of the house, Violet sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection as her makeup artist prepared her for a charity luncheon. The sealed letter from her father lay unopened on the table beside her. "A little more blush, I think," she said, turning her face slightly. "I look pale today." "Yes, Mrs. Harrison," the makeup artist replied, reaching for her brush. Gregory entered the room, already dressed in an expensive suit. "Have you read it yet?" he asked, nodding toward the letter. Violet's eyes flicked to the envelope. "No. Don't you think you should? Everyone else has." "I know what it says," Violet replied, her voice tight. More disappointment. More criticism. Dad was never satisfied with any of us, especially me. Gregory picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. "We need to discuss our strategy about the boy. Thomas called a family meeting for this evening." Violet closed her eyes as the makeup artist applied eyeshadow. "What's there to discuss? Someone has to adopt him or we all lose everything." "The question is who," Gregory said. "Thomas and Penny never wanted children. That's why they don't have any after 15 years of marriage. Daniel lives in Hong Kong half the year. Your mother is too old. That leaves—" "Don't even suggest it," Violet snapped, her eyes flying open. "We are not adopting some random child just for money." Gregory's expression hardened. "This random child is your sister's son, your nephew. And it's not just money. It's your family legacy, the company, everything." Violet turned to face him fully. "You didn't know Rose, you never met her. She was wild, irresponsible. Who knows what this boy has inherited from her, or from whoever the father was. He seemed quiet enough at the will reading, polite, and he's already 11, practically raised himself from what I gather." "That's another thing," Violet continued, warming to her complaints. "He's been in that orphanage for years. Who knows what kind of problems he has? What kind of baggage he'd bring?" Gregory leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. We've been trying to have a child for 3 years. The fertility treatments aren't working. The adoption waiting lists are years long for a healthy infant. This could be our chance." Violet stared at him, sudden understanding dawning in her eyes. "You actually want to do this? You want to adopt him?" "I want us to consider it," Gregory corrected. "Think about it. Instant family, your father's approval from beyond the grave, and securing your rightful inheritance all at once." The makeup artist, sensing the tension, quietly excused herself. As the door closed, Violet picked up the sealed letter. "Let's see what dear old Dad has to say first," she said, breaking the seal with a manicured fingernail. Meanwhile, in the garden, Eleanor had found a bench in the sunshine. She had already read her letter, twice, and now held the photograph of Rose that she had shown to Jamie, her youngest child, her free spirit, the daughter she had failed to protect. "I thought I might find you here." Eleanor looked up to see Catherine approaching with her cane. The older woman moved slowly but with dignity, easing herself onto the bench beside Eleanor. "It was always Rose's favorite spot," Eleanor said softly. "Remember how she would read under that oak tree for hours?" Catherine nodded, following Eleanor's gaze to the massive tree at the edge of the garden. She had such an imagination, always dreaming of other worlds. "I failed her, Kathy," Eleanor whispered, using her sister-in-law's childhood nickname. "When she needed me most, I sided with Richard and Thomas. I let them push her away." Catherine placed a weathered hand over Eleanor's. We all failed her, but now we have a chance to make it right through her son. He has her eyes, Eleanor said. Not just the color, but the way he looks at things, really sees them. Have you read your letter? Catherine asked gently. Eleanor nodded. Richard knew he was dying for much longer than he told us. He had time to think, to regret. He wrote that finding Jamie gave him a second chance he didn't deserve. Catherine smiled sadly. My brother was a complicated man. Hard and soft in equal measure, though he showed the hard side to most people. What will happen to Jamie now? Eleanor asked. I've been thinking. Maybe I could adopt him? Catherine finished for her. At 73? Eleanor straightened her shoulders. I'm his grandmother. It makes the most sense. You've never raised a child on your own, Catherine pointed out. And Jamie needs stability, consistency. Someone with energy to match his. Then who? Thomas would only do it for the money and make the poor boy miserable. Violet has always been too self-absorbed. And Daniel is never in one place long enough. Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering. Perhaps the better question is, what does Jamie want? Has anyone bothered to ask him? Across town, in a modest office at Sunshine Children's Home, Mrs. Chen sat with Jamie and a woman in a tailored suit who had introduced herself as Lisa Parker, the guardian ad litem appointed by Richard Blackwood. So you understand what's happening, Jamie? Lisa asked gently. Your grandfather left you his inheritance, but with the condition that a member of his family adopts you. Jamie nodded, fidgeting with the worn copy of The Little Prince that rarely left his possession these days. They don't really want me, though. They just want the money, Mrs. Chen sighed. We don't know that for certain, Jamie. I saw their faces, Jamie replied quietly. When Mr. Porter read the will, they were angry, not happy. He looked up at Lisa. What happens if nobody wants to adopt me? Then the money goes to charity, Lisa explained. And you would stay here at Sunshine until... She trailed off, not wanting to say until you age out or someone else adopts you. Until someone who actually wants me comes along, Jamie finished for her. Mrs. Chen placed a hand on his shoulder. Jamie, I know this is overwhelming, but try to remember that this is about more than money. You found your family. That's something many children here dream about. But they're strangers, Jamie said, and they don't seem very nice. Except maybe the old lady who showed me my mom's picture. Lisa made a note in her file. That would be Eleanor, your grandmother. What did you think of her? Jamie considered the question. She seemed sad, but not mean like the man in the suit, Thomas. He looked at me like I did something wrong just by existing. Lisa smiled reassuringly. Well, what's important now is what you want. Because ultimately any adoption would require your consent too. You're old enough that the court would take your wishes into account. Jamie looked surprised. I get a choice? Of course, Mrs. Chen said. No one can force you to live with people you don't want to live with. Jamie was quiet for a long moment, thinking. What was my grandfather trying to do? Why did he make it so complicated? Lisa closed her folder. I met with Richard several times while he was drafting his will. He was concerned about the values in his family. He told me that money had changed them and not for the better. I think he saw you as a second chance. Not just for himself, but for the entire Blackwood family. But what if they never change? Jamie asked. What if they adopt me but still don't really want me? That's why I'm here, Lisa said firmly. My job is to make sure that doesn't happen. Your grandfather was very clear that this wasn't just about legal adoption. It's about truly becoming part of the family. As the sun began to set, the Blackwoods gathered in the formal dining room. Thomas sat at the head of the table, where Richard had always sat. Eleanor occupied the other end with Violet, Gregory, and Daniel arranged between them. Catherine sat beside Eleanor, her presence unrequested but unchallenged. We need to decide what to do about the boy, Thomas began without preamble. I've consulted with my lawyer, and contesting the will isn't a viable option. His name is Jamie, Catherine said pointedly. And he's your nephew, not some problem to be solved. Thomas ignored her. The way I see it, one of us needs to step up and become his guardian, for the good of the family and the business. Eleanor spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been in years. I've been thinking about this. I'm his grandmother. It makes sense for me to take him. Violet raised an eyebrow. Mother, be realistic. You're 73. The courts would never approve you as the sole guardian of an 11-year-old boy. She's right, Daniel added. And I'm out of the country too much to provide a stable home. Thomas steepled his fingers. Penny and I have discussed it. We're willing to take the boy, Jamie, if necessary. We have the resources and stability. How generous of you, Catherine said dryly. I'm sure your sudden interest in parenthood has nothing to do with the fortune at stake. Before Thomas could respond, Gregory cleared his throat. Actually, Violet and I would like to be considered. We've been wanting to start a family, and this seems like fate. Violet looked less certain, but nodded in agreement. Eleanor studied her daughter's face. Violet, this isn't like adopting a puppy. This is a child, Rose's child, who has already lost so much. I know that, Mother, Violet replied defensively, but Gregory and I have the youngest household. We could give him the most normal childhood. As the family continued to debate, none of them noticed the small figure standing in the doorway, listening to them argue over his future as if he were a prize to be claimed rather than a person with feelings and fears of his own. Jamie backed away quietly, clutching his book to his chest. He had heard enough to know that nothing had really changed. Despite the revelation, despite the will, he was still just an orphan. Only now he was an orphan worth millions. 2 weeks had passed since the reading of the will. Summer was giving way to fall, and the first golden leaves were beginning to drift from the massive oak tree in the Blackwood garden. The same tree where Rose had once spent hours reading, dreaming of a different life than the one laid out for her. Jamie sat beneath that tree now, his back against the rough bark, legs crossed as he flipped through a photo album Eleanor had given him. Each page revealed another piece of the mother he had never known. Rose at her 5th birthday party, Rose riding a horse, Rose playing the piano at a recital. His fingers traced her face in each image, searching for parts of himself. She loved that oak tree, said a voice, startling Jamie from his thoughts. Catherine stood a few feet away, leaning on her cane. She wore a simple cardigan against the slight chill in the air. My grandmother told me, Jamie replied, closing the album carefully. Catherine smiled. May I join you? Jamie nodded, shifting over to make room on the bench beneath the tree. Catherine lowered herself with the careful movements of someone whose body no longer moved as freely as their mind wished it would. Are they still arguing about me? Jamie asked, looking toward the house where another family meeting was underway. Catherine sighed. I'm afraid so. The Blackwoods have always been good at arguing. It's practically the family sport. A small smile flickered across Jamie's face before disappearing. None of them really want me. They just want the money. Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. Money has a way of revealing who people truly are, Jamie. For some, it brings out their worst. For others, it eventually leads them back to what matters. Is that what my grandfather was trying to do with his will? Lead them back to what matters? Catherine looked impressed. You're very perceptive for 11. Yes, I think that's exactly what Richard was trying to do, in his own complicated way. Jamie opened the photo album again, turning to a family portrait taken about 20 years ago. Richard stood in the center, tall and imposing, with Eleanor beside him. Thomas, Violet, Daniel, and Rose arranged around them. They were all smiling, but there was something stiff about the image, as if they were actors playing a family rather than actually being one. They don't look very happy, Jamie observed. Catherine laughed softly. They weren't, not really. Richard built an empire but forgot to build a family along the way. She pointed to Rose in the photo. Except for your mother. She refused to pretend. That's why she clashed with your grandfather so often. They were actually very much alike, both stubborn, both passionate. Inside the house, the discussion had turned heated. Thomas's voice carried through the open window. This is ridiculous. We've been debating this for 2 weeks. Someone needs to make a decision. Jamie closed the album. I should go back to Sunshine. Mrs. Chen says I can stay there until something gets figured out. Catherine studied him thoughtfully. Is that what you want? To go back? Jamie shrugged, his eyes downcast. It doesn't matter what I want. Nobody's asked me anyway. I'm asking you now, Catherine said gently. Jamie was quiet for a long moment. I want somewhere that feels like home, with people who actually want me there, not just my grandfather's money. He looked up at Catherine. I thought maybe when they found out I was family, they'd want to know me. The real me, not just who they have to adopt to get rich. Inside the house, the debate continued. Thomas paced the living room while Eleanor, Violet, Gregory, and Daniel sat in various states of frustration. Mother is too old to raise a child, Thomas said flatly. The courts would never approve it. I'm not too old to be part of his life, Eleanor countered. And I'm his grandmother. I have the strongest claim. This isn't about claims, Violet interjected. It's about what's best for Jamie. Gregory and I can provide stability, a younger household. Oh, please, Daniel interrupted. You've never shown interest in children before. At least be honest about your motivations. Like yours are so pure, Gregory shot back. You just want to ensure your trust fund continues. Thomas slammed his hand down on the table. Enough, this bickering is getting us nowhere. Maxwell Porter called this morning. The probate court has scheduled a hearing for next week. We need to present a united front. Eleanor stood up suddenly. Has anyone actually asked Jamie what he wants? The room fell silent. Thomas looked irritated by the interruption to his authority. Violet examined her manicure. Daniel had the grace to look slightly ashamed. He's 11, Thomas said dismissively. Children don't know what they want. Rose knew what she wanted at 15, Eleanor replied quietly. And we didn't listen. Look where that got us. Outside, Catherine had taken Jamie's hand in her weathered one. Jamie, there's something I haven't told the others yet. Something I've been thinking about. Jamie looked at her curiously. I have a small house on the edge of the Blackwood property. Richard gave it to me years ago. It's where I've lived since my husband passed away. She paused, gathering her thoughts. It's not fancy like the main house, but it's comfortable. It has a garden and a room that would make a nice bedroom for a boy who likes to read. Jamie's eyes widened as he realized what she was suggesting. I'm 73, just like Eleanor, Catherine continued. Too old to be approved as a guardian on my own, but... She smiled. Eleanor and I have been talking. What would you think if we applied to be your co-guardians? You would live primarily with me, but Eleanor would be there too. We could convert the sunroom at my house into a study space for you. You want to adopt me? Jamie asked, his voice small with disbelief. Very much so, Catherine replied. Not for Richard's money or the company's shares, but because you deserve a family who sees you for who you are. And because in the short time I've known you, I've grown quite fond of you. Jamie didn't respond immediately, afraid to hope. What about everyone else? Won't they be angry? Catherine's eyes twinkled. Oh, I imagine Thomas will be furious. He always did hate not getting his way. But there's nothing in the will that says the guardian has to be Richard's child, just a family member. And I am very much a Blackwood. For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile spread across Jamie's face. Could I still keep going to my same school? And visit Mrs. Chen sometimes? Of course, Catherine assured him. We would change only what needs changing. The rest, the parts that make you you, those stay exactly as they are. Inside the house, the doorbell rang, interrupting the ongoing argument. Henderson, who had remained with the family despite Richard's passing, appeared at the living room entrance. Ms. Parker is here, he announced formally. Lisa Parker, the guardian ad litem, entered the room with her briefcase and a serious expression. Good afternoon. I was hoping to find Jamie here as well. He's in the garden with Catherine, Eleanor replied, standing to greet her. I'll call them in. Before you do, Lisa said, I wanted to inform you that I've completed my initial assessment of the potential guardian arrangements being discussed. I'll be presenting my findings to the court next week. Thomas straightened his tie. Excellent. I assume you found our household to be the most suitable option? Penny and I have the resources and stability that... Lisa held up her hand. Mr. Blackwood, I haven't completed my report yet because I haven't had the chance to fully discuss all options with Jamie himself. His input is critical to my recommendation. He's a child. Thomas repeated his earlier dismissal. A child who has been through more in 11 years than most adults experience in a lifetime, Lisa replied firmly. His wishes matter significantly in this process. The back door opened and Catherine entered with Jamie beside her. Eleanor immediately went to them, placing a gentle hand on Jamie's shoulder. Lisa was just explaining that she needs to speak with Jamie about his preferences, Eleanor explained. Lisa smiled at Jamie. That's right. I need to know what you want, Jamie, not what anyone else wants for you. Jamie looked around at the assembled Blackwoods, Thomas with his impatient frown, Violet and Gregory with their calculating expressions, Daniel with his distant interest. Then he looked at Catherine and Eleanor, who stood slightly apart from the others but together with him. I want to live with Great-Aunt Catherine, he said clearly, And grandmother Eleanor? Thomas's face flushed red. This is absurd. Two elderly women cannot possibly— They want me, Jamie interrupted, his voice stronger than anyone had heard it before. Not just because of the money or because they have to. They actually want me. Lisa made a note in her file, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I see, and have you two discussed this arrangement? She asked Catherine and Eleanor. We have, Catherine replied. We're prepared to file for joint guardianship. I have a house on the property with plenty of room for Jamie. Eleanor would be involved daily but wouldn't have the full physical strain of raising an active boy. This is a setup, Thomas accused. Catherine has always been against me taking my rightful place in this family. She's poisoning the boy against us. His name is Jamie, Eleanor said sharply, and no one is poisoning him against anyone. He's simply observant enough to see what's right in front of him. Lisa closed her notebook. I'll need to inspect Catherine's home and conduct formal interviews with all parties. But I must say this arrangement has potential. It keeps Jamie within the family while providing him with guardians who— She glanced meaningfully at Thomas, appear to prioritize his well-being over financial considerations. 1 month later, Jamie stood in what was now his bedroom in Catherine's cottage. Large windows overlooked the garden and bookshelves lined one wall, already filling with books Eleanor brought him from the main house's library. His few possessions from Sunshine Children's Home looked small in the spacious room, but Catherine had told him they would shop for whatever else he needed when he was ready. On his bedside table sat a framed photograph of his mother, smiling beneath the same oak tree he could see from his window. Beside it was his worn copy of The Little Prince, now joined by other books Richard had loved as a boy. A knock came at his door. Eleanor stood there, a small wooden box in her hands. I found this in Richard's study, she said, entering the room. I think he meant for you to have it. Jamie opened the box carefully. Inside was a chess set, the pieces carved from pale and dark wood, worn smooth from years of handling. He taught you to play, didn't he? Eleanor asked. Jamie nodded, running his fingers over the king piece. Every Wednesday, Eleanor sat on the edge of his bed. Would you teach me? I never learned. Jamie looked up in surprise. Really, you want to learn? I do, Eleanor said. I want to learn about all the things you and Richard shared. All the things I missed with Rose. Her voice caught slightly. If that's okay with you. Instead of answering, Jamie began setting up the chessboard between them. As he placed each piece in its proper square, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Richard's death, a sense that he was exactly where he belonged. Outside, autumn leaves continued to fall from the oak tree. The Blackwood estate stood grand and imposing on the hill. Thomas had returned to running the company, though the board of trustees now oversaw major decisions until Jamie came of age. Violet and Gregory had gone back to their socialite lives, with occasional stilted visits to see their nephew. Daniel had returned to Hong Kong, promising to send presents for birthdays and Christmas. Life had found a new pattern. Not perfect, but real. Not the fairy tale ending of instant family harmony that exists only in stories, but something more valuable, a beginning built on genuine care rather than obligation. As Jamie carefully explained the chess pieces to his grandmother,
Catherine watched from the doorway, a satisfied smile on her face.
Richard's fortune had indeed changed the Blackwood family, just not in the way anyone had expected. For some, it had revealed their worst instincts. For others, it had offered a chance at redemption, and for Jamie, it had given him what money could never buy, a home where he was wanted not for what he was worth, but for who he was.